Good morning. Thank you very much to the organizers and the hosts for having me here and for inviting me to give a keynote lecture on these very important issues of questions of ethics and gatekeeping. As was already mentioned by Brad, you invited people from outside of the Anglo scene, so I'm one of these people whose mother language is not English. And I do apologize for a strange accent, and I hope you will be able to nonetheless follow what I would like to share with you this morning. When thinking about the gate, which I've been doing ever since I was invited to speak at this conference, the gate has been in my mind both metaphorical and literal. So the examples I'm sharing with you also look at the space of the gate in public space, the gate in the museum. And gates are being defined as movable barriers. So we can also think about curating as a way of moving barriers or of ungating, maybe, to coin such a term. The title I've chosen is Curating for the 99%, borrowing from the language of the Occupy movement, and the subtitle is Lessons in Ethics from Decolonial and Feminist Activism. So there's a lot to be learned, and I have more questions than answers, so I will share open-ended questions with you. Starting with a question also, who are the 99%? Today's globalized art world, and I think it's really important to differentiate between global and globalized, with its classed, racialized, and sexualized power system, redeploys what we call patriarchal modernity and colonial dispossession in new old ways. So in a way, we inherit legacies that have to be counteracted upon, but we also see the emergence of new forms of patriarchal, today's hypermodernity, and they also need counteraction or set free new types of agency. And what I'm sharing now is probably very much also from the part of the world where I live, in Europe, and the kinds of debates that have been fueled again in the last years. Historically, many of the objects collected in museums were looted, stolen, or extracted by trade, as we all know. We can consider them prisoners of war, these objects, objects in forced exile, in diaspora, hostages of uneven trade relations. We can consider objects of art very often, not always, but very often, and in particular historically when we think of imperial collections, representative of the world shaped by the 1% and not by the 99%. And the big question then is, how do the 99% recognize themselves, their histories, their traumas, their art, their belongings, their desires, their futures in and through museums and galleries? So I'm not giving up on museums, but I think to understand how museum institutions can become different by way of ungating is the big question that a lot of artists, curators, researchers, administrators, but also members of the public at large find themselves connected with and connected to. In 1993, Douglas Crimp, art historian and queer activist, wrote a book called On the Museum's Ruins. And even though this was not a book on decolonizing the museum, he did write something following the notion of the carceral archipelago that Michel Foucault had analyzed, that is actually very useful to think about the museum as it needs to be changed. So he called the museum an institution of confinement. And I think the gate and confinement, so the gate closing and not letting objects out again, is the other side of gatekeeping. So on one hand, there's a lot of struggle about entering these institutions on one's own terms. But I would say there's also a lot of struggle about exiting institutions, on one's own terms again. What I'm particularly interested in at the moment is monument activism, or what we might want to call monument activism, and museum protests as they occur and take place globally and are, as we witness, on the rise. I will start by sharing, so I will mostly turn to art as a practice of raising these questions, both in and outside the museum. And I will start with the question, where do the 99% find themselves and in which positions? This photograph was taken at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 2016. And when we look at it without a caption, we might not immediately understand that we are actually looking at an artwork, at a performance. I hope the caption is not too small for you so that you can read it. This is a work by Patricia Karchenhout, Surinamese Dutch artist, and it's called The Cleanup Woman. And actually, she wasn't invited by the Stedelijk Museum. They still hold very little artworks by immigrants or people of color in their collection. But she was invited by Australian artist Richard Bell, who had been invited by the Stedelijk Museum to work with them and to collaborate with them. And he then established multi-part collaboration with different partners like the Hip Hop Huis based in Amsterdam, or the University of Color. It's a collective that was initiated by 4 women during the massive strikes at the university that took place in the second decade of the 21st century, as the University of Color continues to work towards decolonizing the curriculum. And Patricia Karchenhout performs the role that many people of color or recent immigrants in European contexts actually do perform in European museums. So they're either guards, so they're actually the gatekeepers because they're the security guards, or they are part of the industrialized cleaning force of what we also might call the maintenance or care force, with a lot of immigrant people performing these kinds of jobs in the museum environment. I'm sorry, I want to share a quote with you before contextualizing this piece art historically. Rosa Tewelde is a Dutch art historian and critic, and she writes about Patricia Karchenhout that her work deals with the colonial past and its implications for the present. But she also points out that a lot of Patricia Karchenhout's work is about the process of healing. And in a piece she has written about this work, Rosa Tewelde quotes Sara Ahmed, feminist and decolonial thinker based in London. And Sara Ahmed has written that whiteness is produced as a host. And this very much applies to museum institutions. So they are hospitable, but when whiteness becomes the host, it is that which is already in place or at home. So we could say gate, or the keeping of the gate and opening the gate, opens to hospitality which is conditional. And I just wonder what unconditional hospitality in curating might be, or what it might look like. Rosa Tewelde also writes that in order to be part of the institution as a person of color, one may obtain, as I already said before, a service job as a security guard or as a cleaner. Patricia Karchenhaut, whom I have recently invited to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where I teach and work, is an activist, an artivist. She calls herself a womanist and also points out in her short biography that she is a mother. She has 3 grown children and 1 adopted child. And she often links her performative work or her installation pieces to iconic feminist art pieces that have been shared widely in Western canonized art history. And here, of course, she refers to the 1973 work by Merle Ukeles Lederle that took place at the Athenaeum in Hartford. And again, I'm showing it to you without the caption before we move on to the caption. So the closeness, the etymological closeness of capture and caption is one that is also interesting when we think about curation and ungating. Merle Lederman Ukeles did the Hartford washing tracks maintenance both inside and outside of the museum. And I'm sharing 2 images that are actually outside, so not inside like Patricia Karchenhaut's work, but in front of the gate. And the difference between these 2 works is, I think, in the way the artist claims the position of either the cleaner or the artist by way of performing. So Rosa Tevelde, whom I have quoted before, says about Patricia Karchenhaut that even friends and colleagues that were present simply failed to recognize her. Or better put, they looked right through her. So we could say, even though her body is hypervisible with the cleaning cart and moving it, she also becomes invisible. And another young Dutch art theorist and historian has compared Karchenhaut's and Ukeles' work. Unlike Karchenhaut, Ukeles performed these duties as herself, a white female artist. So she performed on Sunday at the museum so that she could observe she's Jewish, so that she could observe the Sabbath on Saturday. And it's of course very clear that on Sunday, cleaning staff normally doesn't do the cleaning and also doesn't perform that quite so visibly as we have seen in the photograph. Ukeles performed these duties as herself, a white female artist. Karchenhaut, in her guise as a cleaning woman, draws attention to persistent discrimination within institutions of art against people of color, who are invited into the museum under 2 conditions: as service personnel or on account of the multicultural capital their presence will bestow upon the institution. And this has been discussed a lot, in particular by students of color at the Academy of Fine Arts, and they try to fight back tokenism or a way of being added in order to make the institution look better. So Karchenhaut's performance exposes the racial divide within gendered dimensions of labor and the presence of black or brown bodies in European museums as cleaners or guards. Karchenhaut puts everyday racism, as Dutch Surinamese theorist Philomena Essed has called it, on the agenda in the public sphere. So when we go, so this was in a way the introduction, or if you will, the first chapter. When you go on Wikipedia and look up gatekeeper, this is the image that you find. So this is the gatekeeper at a Hindu temple in India. And I have to admit, this is not my field of expertise or research, so I'm not knowledgeable about Indian temples. But what I thought was very interesting, that it's a physical, material sculpture that represents the gatekeeper on the Wikipedia entry. And gatekeepers are defined as follows: one that is in charge of passage through a gate, And as we have learned before, gates are mobile barriers. So we also have to think about those who are in charge of passage through a gate as those who might be able to make gates more mobile or maybe do away with them altogether. The gatekeeper is also one who monitors or oversees the actions of others. So this is probably the meaning that was most referred to in the title of the gatekeeping conference. And the gatekeeper, and this is also very pertinent, is one who controls access to something, access to information, but also access to services or access to culture, as we have heard before. Again, I'm sharing this artwork with you without a caption first, and I will then explain who the artist is and what we see here. So I'm sorry that the quality of my photograph is not so great. So what is written on this white sheet of paper is "thank you." This is a piece by Rory Macbeth, and it's the statue Flora. It was done in 2003, and it's now part of the permanent collection of the Aarhus Museum in Denmark. And this sculpture actually greets visitors in the entrance area of the museum before the ticketing gates. So it's the only part of the museum. You can go to the shop to your left, and you find yourself in the foyer that's accessible without having to pay. And you can see this is the only artwork you can actually see without having to pay. It's a statue of one of those people who pretend to be a statue. And we know those because they are being performed in many global capitals around the world. Rory Macbeth has done statues like this before. One at the Economist Plaza in London in 2002, which was called "Thank You." And as happened here, people put real money in the basket before the statue. And I also had a conversation with another museum visitor when I visited the museum this summer, who was asking out loud whether this statue was actually a real person or not. So the semblance to a living being performing like 24/7 permanently such a sculpture that then earns money and makes a living was reason for confusion. Is this real, or is this living, or is this real as a real sculpture? So these are the lines that are being attacked. As you might remember, Rory Macbeth has been attacking barriers or borders of entrance for a long time. In 1996, when he started studying in London at Central St. Martin's together with Laura Lord, he enrolled a totally invented student, a fake student, someone who didn't insist. The student by the name of Francis Neal actually made very high marks and also pointed to the maybe negligence in the administration that was being exploited in order to do this artwork. The second sculpture that I encountered when I visited the Aarhus Museum of Art this summer, and that made me immediately think of the gatekeeping conference and the question of the gate, is this sculpture. And I took the photograph so that one can see how she is being installed there. This is a sculpture by Lars Bent Petersen, and it's called Stereotype Immigrant, 1-to-1, and it was done in 2002. I'm now moving from inside the museum and sculptures that I found close to the ticketing gates or close to those parts of the museum closed off to the general public, to Trafalgar Square in London, so that we can think together about gatekeeping sculptures, equestrian horse statues, imperial sculptures that are actually very often placed in front of the gate, be it a national museum, be it an imperial collection, or be it an imperial palace. Very often they have large, expansive public spaces in front of them where we would find these physical, larger-than-life gatekeepers, very often on horses, often also standing up. Trafalgar Square in London dates back to the mid-19th century. In 1830, it was decided that the square would be dedicated to remembering the Battle of Trafalgar, and 4 plinths were placed on the square. 3 of them have sculptures on them commemorating imperial and war-related heroes. The last one, the 4th plinth, has been empty since 1850 because the government ran out of money. So they didn't commission a 4th sculpture. And in the 21st century, the 4th plinth has become an ongoing and curated project. So the 4th plinth as an empty plinth was in a way understood and discovered as an opportunity to realize large-scale temporary sculptures, typically installed for the period of 9 months or a year and a half. There is a special 4th plinth commission, and they work as part of the Mayor of London's culture team. So we can see also here the connection of a post-imperial condition and how public art is being integrated into cultural policies and cultural politics in a representative democracy. The person we see here is Alison Lepper. She was born without arms and also has shortened legs. And we see her here a little over 3 meters high as a sculpture made out of marble by Mark Quinn. And Alison Lepper is also an artist in her own right. She had a lot of, as one can find when one reads about her and reads interviews with her and also watches interviews that she has given that are to be found online, that she had many reservations about becoming a model for the 4th plinth, but finally gave in to becoming such an enormously big public sculpture. And her being exhibited there has actually raised awareness for disability across the UK. And a lightweight version of this sculpture was part of the Paralympics in 2012. So the sculpture became, in a way, an ambassador, but it also has raised visibility and awareness for her practice as an artist. She graduated from art school, the School of Fine Arts in Brighton in the UK in 1994, and has also received an MBE, the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. But when you go online and research newspaper articles that were published shortly after the installation, There's also a lot of ambivalence and controversy what such a large-scale, pregnant white body means in public space. There's a very interesting essay written by Rosemarie Betterton called Alice and Leper Pregnant, Embodied Geographies, Post-Imperial Identities and Public Sculpture in London's Trafalgar Square. And I think it navigates all these complex questions and the contradictions that come with such a work. I'm now moving from the European context to the Rhodes Must Fall movement in Cape Town, and we are still in the same year of 2015. Rhodes Must Fall was and is a movement that originated in South Africa, but in effect became a transnational movement against the legacy and legacies in plural of Cecil Rhodes. The performer artist we see here is Setembele Msezane, and she performed the very day the Rhodes sculpture was being removed, so taken away from its plinth on 9th April 2015 as the national emblem of Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe bird. These birds made out of soapstone are actually carved birds from the ruined city of Great Zimbabwe. So they are the largest, they are part of the largest ancient stone construction in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of these birds was stolen and looted and actually kept by Cecil Rhodes in his house. So that's why she chose the Zimbabwe bird as a symbol, reclaiming it as a symbol of freedom and also liberating it from the Rhodes connection. On April 9, 2015, the Cecil John Rhodes statue was scheduled to be removed after a month of debates for and against its removal by various stakeholders. So he, one could say, is also one of these physical gatekeepers in front of the university. And one of the strategies that we see here is removal, which then leaves open the question, what will happen curatorially with such a removed statue that is now in the deep storage of the museum? This caused widespread interest in statues in South Africa. Opinions varied, but the media focused on problematizing the removal of statues. And Cezanne says about the bird that she embodied and performed, standing still for a period of almost 4 hours. Her name was Chapungu. She was a soapstone bird that was looted from Great Zimbabwe in the late 1800s and is still currently housed in Cecil John Rhodes' estate in Cape Town. Chapungu's wings, along with the crane, rose to declare the fall of Cecil John Rhodes. This image, one could say, became a global image that traveled via social media, but also in a lot of different newspaper articles, and brings together politics, art, and activism through a 4 hours long performance, but also its documented afterlife that is very much a visual, digital afterlife. Cecil Rhodes was a magnate, a colonialist, a white supremacist, and he believed that the first race in the world was the Anglo-Saxon race, and he firmly promoted settler colonialism and founded the British South Africa Company. But I think what is really interesting in relating to the question of ethics and gatekeeping is that he also initiated the Rhodes Scholarship, as you all know. So this is the oldest and first large-scale program of international scholarship that was initiated in the year of 1902. And the idea was to promote and nourish and increase unity between English-speaking nations. And Rhodes scholars include prime ministers and presidents, such as the Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke, or also Bill Clinton. Until 1977, women were excluded from the Rhodes Scholarship, so one might wonder, for better or for worse, to have been included or excluded. And even though not made explicit, it was very rare that people who didn't have a white skin color were understood as possible recipients of the Rhodes Scholarship. Cameroonian philosopher who is now based at the University of Witwatersrand, Achille Mbembe, who has written on the post-colony, joined the Rhodes Must Fall movement and gave some very important lectures which can still be found online. The statue of Rhodes was done by a female sculpture by Marion Walgate, unveiled in 1934, and had been commissioned by the state-run university. He lived from 1853 to 1902, and that's his own words. I will let you read them. I will not read them out loud. This is the map that shows Rhodes' British Empire corridor through Africa as he envisioned it. And this is the result of the Rhodes Must Fall movement becoming a transnational movement and actually moving to Oxford, England, where the Rhodes Must Fall collective published this book. The next example I'm sharing with you is from Berlin, Germany, and I will translate the caption. They are celebrating in white, we are mourning in black. Berlin, June 12, 2015, on the occasion of the topping out ceremony for the Berlin Palace. So I grew up in the world of the Cold War, and if you had asked me what is more unlikely to happen, that the Berlin Palace would be rebuilt one day, or that the wall would come down, I would probably not have known what to choose out of those two. So both in my growing up were considered next to impossible. And while of course the coming down of the wall was an event to be celebrated, the building of the Berlin Palace, or the reconstruction of the Berlin Palace, is, as I would say, not much reason for celebration. The Berlin Palace is located on the Museum Island, and it was used by the kings of Prussia, by the German emperors, and it was demolished by the German Democratic Republic government in the 1950s. And then they built there, instead of the Berlin Palace, the Palace of the Republic. Conveniently enough, they found asbestos. So if you want to get rid of a building that stands for not so popular ideology, that's a very good argument you will have on your side. So the building is toxic, not the ideology. So it had to come down in 2008. And then people like me still wouldn't believe that there was really serious attempts of rebuilding the castle. But now we can see that the castle is almost there. This is a photograph of the web that I took off the webcam, where you can follow in real time how the process of building and construction is moving on. What the castle will host in the future are the collections of the Ethnological Museum of Berlin and of the Museum of Asian Art. And this is what, and it will be called Humboldt Forum, dedicated to remembering the two Humboldt brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm, who had to do with knowledge production, both in their own way. Alexander as person who traveled and wrote extensively on nature, geology, cartography, mostly of South America, where he's being commemorated in a number of like 200 rivers and mountains named after him. And his brother Wilhelm, who was instrumental for coming up with the German university system, but also being an advisor to the kings when it came to their imperial collections. And this Humboldt Forum is protested against, as most of the objects that will be on display there represent colonial looting and very uncanny discontinuities of how this is being curated, exhibited, and made accessible to the public today. They claim the state museums of Berlin are not the legitimate owners of their holdings. The majority of the over 500,000 valuable items from all over the world ended up in Berlin through colonial conquests. We demand the disclosure of the ownership history of all the exhibits, as well as the adherence to the UN resolution, which is unequivocal regarding the repatriation of cultural artifacts to countries which have been the victims of expropriation. This is particularly important regarding the stolen human remains in the possession of the preußischer Kulturbesitz, the so-called Prussian ownership of culture, which is foundation. And what I just read to you is part of the No Humboldt 21 resolution, which came about in 2013. The cultural treasures of the world remain exclusively for the good of the people of the North. In the written concept, the president of the foundation, Hermann Parzinger, invites, so now it gets really interesting. He invites visitors from Asia or the descendants of indigenous Indian or African societies to the German capital to come and visit, to look at the things that were looted, stolen, and expropriated. In an era where people drown daily in the Mediterranean Sea because they have no other means to enter Europe, or what is now being called the Fortress Europe, such an invitation can only be described as cynical. Aminata Traoré, she was the former Culture and Tourist Minister of Mali, put this in a nutshell. Our cultural works enjoy civil rights in places where even our entire community is denied permission to stay. And I thought that was a very appropriate quote to share for the questions and political issues and politics of gatekeeping. In November 2018, the SAR-Savoy report was published and has now also been translated into English and can be found online. Benedict Savoy, a French art historian who for many years has been a professor at Berlin Technical University. She's a professor of art history. Together with Senegalese economist Feline Sarr, has done extensive research on the colonial possessions in French museums and made suggestions for what is called repatriation. In the German newspaper Die Zeit on July 24th, 2019, an interview with Felvine Sarr was published, and the title of the interview was a quote by Felvine Sarr with reference to what has happened since 2018 after the report has been published, and he stated, "Next to nothing has happened." The next example I want to share with you not so much addresses the question of colonial legacies in museums, but the gendered gaze, if you will, that we look at and that looks at us when we go and visit museums and look at a lot of the artworks on display. Sonia Boyce, British Afro-Caribbean artist, stands here as a kind of one-woman demonstration after she had been attacked over her takeover of the Manchester Art Gallery, with the takeover being a curatorial format in which artists are being invited to take over the gallery and to intervene into the existing setup of the gallery or its content or its orientation. And here, after she was being attacked, and I will explain in a minute why she was attacked, she stands there and says, "Won't give in and I won't feel guilty." So all this discontent, public outrage came about because this painting, Hylas and the Nymphs by John William Waterhouse, which is on show at the Manchester City Galleries, was taken down for 1 week. And this had come about after months of discussions that Sonia Boyce held with representatives of the museum, lots of different people working at the museum, curators, custodians, people who work in the service and cleaning duties there. So lots of different parts that had engaged in conversations with her. And the main concern that came out of these discussions were concerns around gender. And so she decided that she would take gender as the lens through which to frame her takeover. So on one hand, she removed a piece, not permanently, but for a week. And on the other hand, she invited the drag collective Family Georges, the drag collective Family Gorgeous and Lasana Shavas to perform as part of the takeover and to address questions of sexualization and racialization. So here we have seen the strategy of removal at work once permanently with Rhodes Must Fall, then temporary removal as with Sonia Boyce's suggestion, and then here we will see the claim for removal, but Theodore Roosevelt accompanied by a Native American and an African has, as we all know, not yet been removed from the entrance or his gatekeeping in front of the American Museum of Natural History. In 2016, protesters covered the Roosevelt statue with a parachute, and this was part of the anti-Columbus Day tour that the still active collective Decolonize This Place did that day. And both Decolonize This Place has engaged in many other actions that you can find online, but also the anti-Columbus Day tours have been continued and now take place regularly on October 10th. And the last piece I'm sharing with you shows us another strategy of working when it comes to work around and with gatekeeping. And it's maybe, in my understanding, one of the most complex strategies, but maybe also one of the most healing or the most future-oriented. Artist Simone Lee did a large-scale social practice work and installation work titled The Waiting Room at the New Museum in New York in 2016. The title, The Waiting Room, is a strategy of memory work and remembrance. It's dedicated to Esmeen Elizabeth Green, who was a care worker, emigrated to the United States from Jamaica in order to send home money to her children in Jamaica. And after she lost her job as a caregiver for both children and the elderly, she suffered from depression and ended up involuntarily at the waiting room of Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. She was, as is captured on the surveillance camera that is installed at the waiting room, left alone and ignored for 24 hours. And a blood clot had formed in her body, and this caused her death. So she died in the waiting room. And Simone Lee dedicated the waiting room to her memory, but also in a way turned the waiting room not in a room to wait, but in a room for not waiting, in a room for agency and providing different types of holistic healthcare practices for collective self-care and collective community care. And she worked around museum mechanisms such as entrance by making the museum accessible for specific groups without entrance and also after hours. So that was one of the strategies to work around gatekeeping, also forming a lot of different alliances and strategic partnerships for youth and women empowerment, but then also initiated Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matters. And they took over the museum after closing hours. So the gates were only opened for all the Black women artists who became part of this coalition. And without any curators present or any curators intervening, they prepared a public day, a program to be held in September, and used the museum as an intimate public space. And I think this category of an intimate public space through which the museum can also become a safe space, and as we see in this strategy, a separatist safe space, was in a way her way of ungating the museum. She wrote, "We will be hosting," and now hosting happens not on the condition of whiteness, if we remember Sara Ahmed's quote from before. "We will be hosting these workshops when the museum is closed." And now I think comes the most important part. This does not feed into the spectacle economy, into the greed of looking, if you will. There won't be any spectatorship. No photography or video, she says. So when you go online, there are some videos or there are some photographs, but they were all taken by Black women artists for Black Lives Matter, and they're actually on their Facebook site. This is a long-standing tradition of continuing your work underground when you're not allowed to do it in public. I don't feel like I'm doing anything new. It's just different because it is in an art context. So rather than transparency or visibility, the word we might use here is opacity, to refer to Edouard Glissant. Thank you very much.